What's one swimming myth that you've encountered that you'd like to debunk once and for all?
First and second days, I watched every athlete swim. Let's say it was 25 swimmers. Out of 25, something like 20 of them did exactly the same thing, which is the biggest problem, the biggest mistake you can make. And that's what I call the death move now, because once you do it, you're dead in the water. You're not going anyplace.
Welcome to the Effortless Swimming Podcast. My guest today is a returning guest, someone who we had on quite recently. It is Joe Friel. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Brendan. Glad to be here. Thank you for asking me.
I was talking to you before the podcast saying that the episode that you're on before was our second most listened to episode, because I think the PDLC method that we talked about on that podcast really resonated with people. We've got a lot of triathletes and open water swimmers who listen, and I think they really resonated with that. And obviously your experience and background in the sport has, you got a vast depth of knowledge. So I think it was really popular among our listeners. So thank you for being on the podcast previously. And if you haven't listened to that, go back to that episode and listen, because I think there were some really good technique tips amongst the other things that we talked about. I want to talk about some slightly different things on today's episode, because you've just recently updated a book that you wrote originally in 1996 or 1997, you said.
It's about that 97, yeah.
That's it, on its 5th edition. I just want to jump into some of the updates that you've made with that book. So what is it that you've been studying the last couple of years that you've updated for this edition?
Oh, I suppose the biggest change that's made in this book was to really open up more about ways to establish intensity zones. I left swimming the same. I've always felt I had that pretty well nailed down, but I was never really quite confident that I really had exactly what I wanted for run and bike, for example, the other two sports in triathlon. And so I gave that a lot of thought and tried to make it more personalized, so the athlete can pick a system they want to use, like max heart rate or functional threshold heart rate or these same or power sort of things. So this is kind of the way I try to do it, is to make it a little bit more, allowing the athlete to choose what they want to do, rather than telling them there's only one way to do this. Because quite honestly, the most variables, the most poorly designed of coaching athletes isn't that is far most do, and it's not 100% right for everybody all the time. I wouldn't swear now that what I've just now written in this book is going to be right for everybody, but it's a good starting place for people who want to figure it out for themselves. They can have at least some place to begin the quest for what should my zones be when I'm working out.
And what would factor into someone's decision on which method that they choose?
Let me back up and give you an example. When I first came out with the zone system I used, I never got any complaints at all about swimming, matter of fact, which is interesting. That one, that's been since like you mentioned, the late 90s sometime when I wrote that, came up with that system. That has never had anybody question it or ask about why, but running and cycling intensity zones, especially heart rate, I've had a lot of, I wouldn't call it pushback, but a lot of questions on why. And one of the most common responses I got, common comments I got from people, was in heart rate. And it just seemed like the upper end of zone 1 was too hard. I heard that, I can't tell you how many times, but I heard it many, many times from athletes. It seemed like the upper end of zone 1 was just a little bit too hard. And so when they would say that to me, I'd always go back with, well, if you think that's the case, then change your zone. We're not all built exactly the same way. So if it doesn't fit you in that way, try something different, lower it, see what happens. I don't know if anybody ever did, because they never get back to me and say, yeah, I figured it out. They never say that, but at least I tried to get them to do what they should do, is to figure out a zone that works for them, a zone system that works for them. So that was the most common complaint I got. So what I tried to do with the most recent book, which just came out, is to give the athlete some options on how to set their zones. For example, they could use max heart rate, and then they could use percentages of max heart rate to come up with their zones. Or they could use functional threshold heart rate, which is involved in doing a test. For example, in cycling or running, 20-minute test in which you find your your average heart rate. And there's some mathematics which we won't go into right now, but that's another way of doing it that I include in the book. And I'm not saying that those are perfect either, because this is not perfection. This is simply trying to get as close as we can to what the athlete should be doing. And there are other ways too that I mentioned in the book, like using lactate analysis to determine your zones. That's one that's becoming quite popular right now, especially because the Norwegian training methods have been going around now for a couple of years. A lot of people who are using lactate threshold as a way of determining this. That's another option I mentioned in the book. You can use lactate to determine this. What I found, though, is that most people don't want to get involved in puncturing their finger frequently throughout the day to find out what their zones are. So most people don't do it. They may have one test done and then they kind of accept that as being the gospel, but it probably needs to be rethought many, many times going forward, because it's unlikely that it'll stay exactly the same over time. And there's obviously room for error too in doing a test like that. So I try to make it available to the athlete to find different ways of doing this. And I'll find out when people start writing me emails and telling me, hey, it doesn't work because of this, that, or the other thing. They're never afraid to tell me why.
It's part of it is like it's kind of like swimming technique. There's so many different ways you can get from one end of the pool to the other. And for each person, it's going to be different. You think of like a straight arm technique over the water, more bent elbow recovery. It's like there's no right or wrong. It just depends on maybe the event you're training for. It depends on what suits you best. So sometimes people get caught up in all the different things and then they end up not making a decision, and then they're just kind of in no man's land. So I think half the battle is just pick one, go with it. And that's going to get you probably 95% of the way there on your journey to becoming a better triathlete or a better swimmer. Like just pick something, go for it, start the training, and you're going to be well on your way, as opposed to, debating it for the next 6 months and not doing anything. So I see that with, sorry, you go, Joe.
So I mentioned in the book that training zones are not magic. If you go over your training zone by 1 or 2 beats per minute, for example, let's talk about heart rate. Is that a problem? Probably not. You go 8 to 10 beats over, it's probably a problem then. But this is something that we're doing. It's clear cut. It's got a lot of room for variation, a lot of room for individuality. So the athlete needs to kind of be aware of what they're experiencing when they're using a heart rate monitor or a power meter or whatever it may be.
Mm. And another thing that you cover in the book is heart rate variability. Can you share a practical example of how an athlete would use HRV in their daily training decisions?
Yeah, I do. This has been around for a long time, actually, but it's only, I suppose, popular is the right word in athletics. Probably in the last 5 years. Biggest is how do I know when to rest and how do I know when I'm ready to start training again? The easy answer to that question, which is what I've always used in the past, is that when it feels like it's time, do it. If it feels like it's time to rest. It feels like it's time to start again. But the problem athletes run into is they're so highly motivated that they kind of second guess themselves. Athletes will seldom say to themselves, I think I need to rest. That is extremely rare for an athlete to say that to themselves. Same thing with, I think I should rest longer. That's one thing an athlete will almost never say to themselves. I need to start right away and get at it. I'm losing too much fitness here. I need to get back to training again. And so we athletes tend to lose perspective on the importance of rest and recovery in performance. That's critical to success in sport. And yet we don't give it nearly enough attention as athletes. Coaches do. Coaches seem to give it a lot more thought, a lot more determination. So in the first book, I came up with a method I would help the athlete try to figure out when to take a rest break. Ask questions. Let's measure your heart rate first thing in the morning and see what it's telling us. How does that heart rate compare with your normal range of resting heart rates? Is it high, for example? If it's high, that's a marker that says maybe you should take a rest day. Then there's markers such as, how'd you sleep last night? Well, I didn't sleep very well. I was awake for a couple of hours. Hey, maybe that's another marker that you should take some recovery time. As we start put together a list of markers like that, the idea being that the athlete could ask themselves these questions early in the morning, take measurements like HRV, like heart rate, like how they slept, their appetite, how they feel, all kinds of things. And from that, draw a conclusion about if they should take a break from training, if it's time to do that, or if they're on the other end of this, if they've been recovering for a few days and now it's time to start back, am I ready to start again? So that's what I was doing. And HRV kind of simplifies a lot of that. I wouldn't say it's perfect. I find with myself that there are times when it doesn't blend in, doesn't match what I'm feeling and what I discovered that day when I work out. But I think it's a really good way of forcing you to think about it. You know, if you get that marker up on HRV that says, train easy today, don't go hard, or whatever it may be, but based on the app you're using, take it easy. You know, that forces you to say to yourself, do I need to really take it easy? And hopefully you're going to say to yourself, well, I need to think about that a little bit, or let's think about a few other things that have to do with my recovery and where I am right now. So that's what HRV is all about. I think it's more, I'd rather see you use that for that purpose than to make hardcore decisions just based on HRV. Good tool, but not perfect.
Excellent. So the technology's there, the data's there, but you've also just got to be aware of how you're feeling, ask those other questions, and not just rely on the tech side of things, right?
Right. That's exactly.
Now, I want to shift gears a little bit here. Is there what's one swimming myth that you've encountered that you'd like to debunk once and for all? What's something you hear regularly? If you can stop at one, there's probably a few, right?
I'll tell you the one that screws up most triathletes. This was one that I kind of suspected back in the early days of triathlon, but I've forgotten what year it was. Put on a camp in Spain. I forgot I forgot where it was now. But at that camp, we used the local pool, which is an excellent pool, and they happen to have an underwater observatory where coaches could go, or anybody could go down and observe in the pool above, which was it wasn't actually the open water of the pool itself. This was just a chamber within the pool, so you can see with a what do you call it, a stream of water coming at the swimmer. What's the word for that? I forgot.
Like the endless pool, you mean, or like the swim spa?
Yeah, it's like an endless pool sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so the idea was you could have the athlete swim in that chamber, I call it, and you could observe what they were doing. And I had a group of campers, they're triathletes. I don't know how many, 25 to 30 athletes, something like that. So I went down in the first and second days. I watched every athlete swim. Let's say it was 25 swimmers. Out of 25, something like 20 of them did exactly the same thing, which is the biggest mistake you can make. And that's what I call the death move now, because once you do it, you're dead in the water. You're not going anyplace. And that's to reach out in front of you with your elbow below your hand. As soon as you get your elbow below your hand, there's nothing you can absolutely do other than push straight down in the water, which doesn't propel you forward whatsoever. And you don't get a catch, what we typically call a catch, until your hand's about under your belly someplace. So you wind up with a catch, which is about this long, as a catch, instead of a catch which is as long as your arm is. That's the biggest mistake I see with triathletes. And so that's the one I had to focus on the most. And that was the start of this whole process I use in coaching athletes, which I referred to as PDLC. Because that was one of the things I had to really drill into athletes, was you cannot do that. Once you do that, you're just not going to go forward. You're just going to be still. You're going to slow down the water until you finally get a catch. It'd be kind of like running with the stride that's about that long. That's the same idea. you wouldn't go anyplace. You'd just be going really slow forward, but it'd be just tiny little steps you're taking. And the same thing in swimming. If you get a short stroke, you're not going forward. You're just simply standing still until your hand gets finally to the place where you can catch. So you get me started here because that's one of my favorite topics to talk about.
Yeah.
Getting the catch.
It's we had a guy, Lee Nugent. He's a legendary Aussie swim coach and done a lot of work with some of the top swimmers in Australia. And one of the things he mentioned on the podcast was that if your hand is higher than your elbow, you just cannot propel yourself forwards. You've got no ability to catch. So when you're reaching forwards, that hand has got to get either to the same depth at the beginning of your elbow, but then you've eventually just got to get it down. And a really common thing that I see with filming is that when you film someone from above, if they are crossing the center line when they're extending, it's fairly common to see that elbow drop, because I think it's a more comfortable position for the shoulder to be in when they're out in front and crossed over. So the elbow drops a bit there. And sometimes we just have to start with direction. We call it swimming on train tracks, just in that reach phase, but got to get that right first for a lot of people. And then it's much easier to set the catch. And I had a guy on Sunday just going into the clinic who we just had to focus on the direction, get him straight. And then pretty quickly his catch began to improve because he had a good sense of the movement, but he was just crossing over and making it really hard for himself. So it's such a big one. And you when you look at the underwater footage from the side, if someone is either like going in really deep as well, they're not extending out, and you see their catch is might be 15 centimeters of water that they're sort of holding there. It's like you could triple that, you could quadruple that if you just get the right length and everything. So there's so many little things that people can improve. And I was talking about this before. We were talking about this before we started the podcast. I think that's why I've got a job, is that swimming's a really hard thing to do, and there's no end in sight to improvement. You can always improve with these little 1%ers, and that's what makes it fun. That's what I love about coaching. It's solving a puzzle, and to me, that's a really enjoyable part of what I do. Can you share a moment or an experience in your career that's really tested your resolve or your beliefs about swimming training?
Oh yeah. This goes back to the 90s, and I like to go to races. When I wasn't racing, I would try to go watch races just to see what people are doing. Especially, I wanted to see what the pros were doing, the best in the sport. I wanted to see what they were doing. For example, in the swim. So one year, there was an Ironman in Phoenix, which wasn't too far away from where I lived at the time. It was only about a 30-minute drive from where I lived. And the race was in a canal. Swim was in a canal. So you could walk along the edge of the canal, and you could stay right with the swimmers while they were swimming. And so the race started, and I watched pros take off, and so I'm walking around along the canal, watched them swim, and something dawned on me that had never dawned on me before. I don't know why I caught it that day, but all of a sudden I saw that almost all of them are doing exactly the same thing, which is something I never taught to anybody, which is to have their hand way above the water as they were reaching forward, as opposed to putting the hand in the water somewhat close to their heads. Their fingers weren't entering the water until their arm was fully extended. And so that kind of struck me. And so I went back and started toying around with it myself to see what was going on there. And I began to realize that what they were doing, what you really should be doing in open water swimming, which is to reach over the water as much as you can, because the water is not smooth. It can be very, very rough. And so if you get your hand up high, that puts you in a position where you can grab more water and therefore have, as what we talked about before, a catch, because you've grabbed more water by doing this. It also gets your hand in the right position. You get your fingers below your elbow. When you do that, when you reach out with your arm fully extended above the water, and it's in fact, one of the things I teach athletes to do is one of the drills I have them do when we're learning this technique. So I call it just a splash drill. So what they do is they reach out as far as they can as they're swimming freestyle. They reach out as far as they can in the front and splash their hand down as hard as they can on the water, so they can really feel the power of their hand hitting the water. And I want that to be as far away from their body as they can, so they can even pull their head up if they want to see where it is. So when they come into the water, their hand is like that, real hard. And so I chastise them. They don't make it hard enough. They make it too pretty. They make it too smooth. Let's really reach out and really smack that water so we know where your hand is at all times. I want to hear the water splashing. And so I keep taking them through this over and over and over and over. And finally, they get the idea that they've got to really reach out there when they're making this move. And so that was the first one. The first things I ever learned was from watching pro triathletes, and it caused me to think about what I was teaching to my triathletes. So, and there's been many, many other events like that in my life also, but that was one of the first I recall, which is really important.
And why do you think that the best swimmers, the pro triathletes, why do you think they make that change compared to in the pool?
Yeah, well, for one thing, they don't have rough water. The water is obviously in a pool, the water is not nearly as rough as it's going to be if you're swimming open the water, like in the ocean, especially. That canal was pretty calm. So that wasn't going to be an issue there, but they were all still doing it anyway. They were all still reaching above their heads with a straight elbow, basically, almost a straight elbow, and then reaching far out before they made contact with the water with their hand. And they all do that, by the way, still today. When I watch the pro triathlon start, I always watch for that, and immediately you see it. In fact, you look at pictures of the start of a pro race, you'll see the hands up high in the air. You won't see elbows high in the air. You'll see hands high in the air because they learn to do that in open water. If you're swimming in the ocean and there's waves that are, if really deep waves, that's the sort of thing that's going to really mess you up if you're trying to reach into it. If you get your hand above it, you don't have the water pushing back against you. Your hand's in the air. The air is not nearly as dense as the water is. So you can reach over that wave and grab the water and pull yourself forward, which is what we're trying to do. And so I think that's the reason why pro triathletes got into doing it. If it wasn't for the open water swimming, I don't think it would be nearly as popular as it is. If it's all pools, we would see nearly as many people doing that.
And I think as well, like that's because when I look at most swimmers, I think of myself as well, doing this, when I go from the pool to the open water, my stroke rate comes up quite a bit, especially if I've got a wetsuit on. And I think part of that is you're sitting higher, so you can kind of get your stroke rate up higher as well. But it's that reach over the water where you kind of throw the hand out there. You get this momentum over the top, and then there's obviously less glide. So you're going to start the catch sooner, and you can get the stroke rate up a bit quicker that way. I do find that people going from the pool to the open water, they find that their times do suffer. They do find that open water swimming a bit of a challenge. So I really like that tip is reach out further, throw that hand forwards, and then get a bigger catch, get a bigger paddle, and play around with that. One of the kind of got these three words that I use with people when I'm teaching them to swim open water. It's higher, so sort of higher with the hand over the top, faster, and sometimes wider because people are trying to have his hand close to the body. So higher, faster, wider. And it's interesting to hear you talk about what you noticed there because, that was my interpretation of it when I started teaching open water or coaching open water swimming. It was higher, wider, faster with the hand over the top. So, I like that. It's nice to see it kind of come together there.
I think you're right. Well, I've seen athletes do also, which is one of the things I try to correct, is exactly what you mentioned, which is to bring the hand up in this position before they put it in the water. So it's very close to the head. And that I've always found that to be an ineffective way of getting a catch. So that's where I started going this idea of getting a little bit higher in the water, over the water, to reach out to grab the water, as opposed to trying to do it next to your head. But I still see coaches teaching that. It blows me away. I'll see somebody on YouTube or something on how to coach open water swimming, and they're teaching this movement of getting your elbow really high with your hand next to your head, and then reach out under the water like you're putting your hand into a sleeve or reaching into the mailbox or something they typically call it. And I find that to be a tremendous waste of energy to do it that way, and you wind up in a very poor position also to grab the water, as we've been talking about here.
And in terms of your sort of like coaching career, has there been a specific instance where you've found that you've had to like go against what that you sort of mentioned one, but go against what other people are teaching, or just like you had something in mind where you thought, no, I think this is how it needs to be done. I'm going to teach or coach this way, even though there was other people coaching in a different way.
Yeah, there's it's an endless list of things, quite honestly. Don't know where to begin. Let's just stick with swimming. When I came up, when I started deciding how I was going to swim, train the swimmers for triathlon, one of the things I decided was that most triathletes don't need to be doing intervals in the pool. It's really a waste of time for them to do that. They mostly just create a lot of bubbles around themselves and don't go anyplace. They're still slow. And so I started working with athletes with the idea that until they got to a fairly decent time in the pool, all we were going to work on was technique. We're just going to work on, as I think I did in your last podcast, I talked about PDLC. We're just going to work on those four things, which if there's probably one or two of these things that the athlete's really weak on, we're going to focus on that, and that's all we're going to work on. In fact, I had them do exactly the same workouts all the time. I'm sure people get really tired of it, but that's part of the thing of trying to become good at something is to repeat it until you become so integrated to your who you are as a swimmer that you don't have to think about it anymore. It just is what you do. And so I would have them from a 24 kind of fast things about the catch and pool, stop and stay there for as long as they want. Don't time it. Don't say, "Oh, I got to go again in 10 seconds." No. Stay there until you feel like you're ready to go again. In the meantime, take your mind off of swimming and think about something else. I told them to think about what they're going to do for supper tonight, or what they're doing at the job today, or somebody in the lane next to them and how they look swimming, or whatever you want to think about. But for quite a long time, several seconds, 20, 30, 40 seconds, think about something else. Then begin to bring your mind back to the stroke again, the thing you're working on. Begin to focus your memory on that and swim another 25 moderately fast, working on just that one thing. Let's do that until it becomes a habit. Then we'll go to something else and work on it. Athletes are all the same. They all want to go immediately to the end. If I tell athletes in running, the hardest workouts you could do would be to do 5 times 3 minutes with 90-second recoveries, all done at your aerobic capacity pace. If I tell an athlete that, that's what they'll do tomorrow. They will go out and do 5 times 90, 5 times 3 minutes, and so forth. But the point is, you don't start out by doing the most difficult thing. You start out by doing the most easy thing. You start out by running 30 seconds at aerobic capacity with a minute and a half recovery. And over the course of several weeks, you build up to doing this 5 times 3 minutes. That 5 times 3 minutes will be very good when you finally do it. But if you start out doing it, it's never going to improve. It's going to be a piece of crap. It's always going to be worthless, a waste of your time. It's the same thing in the pool. If all you do is do intervals all day, the entire workout, and you get done and you're breathless and you think that was good, I would say for the most part, most triathletes, most age group triathletes did not accomplish anything in the pool. All they did was made themselves tired. They didn't get any better. They're not necessarily faster because of this workout today. So let's get to what's holding you back. What's holding you back is your technique. You're not being held back by your aerobic capacity, your stamina, your economy, yes, that's because that's a skill. You're not being held back by these physiological things we typically think. If you're being held back just because you don't have good technique. If I'm working with a golfer, I don't have the golfer go out and play 18 holes every day and try to see if they can shoot below par. What I have the golfer do is go to the driving range and work on hitting a ball. Let's see if you can hit the ball squarely in the middle of the club face with your driver. That's a good starting place. If we can get to that point, then we can build on that. And there's other things we're going to do along the line besides just try to get the ball to the middle of your club face. There's all kinds of things we can do to improve your swing. It's the same thing with swimming. It's a very, very technical sport. It's not the sort of thing you can do just off the top of your head. Even if you've done it 1,000 times, you may never have yet figured it out. I know lots of golfers who've never figured out how to swing a golf club, but they've been doing it for 20 years and they haven't figured it out yet because they've never really got down to what is the basic element of the movement I have to make. What is that movement? And then practice that movement. They want to go right to the end and do 5 times 3 minutes aerobic capacity. Everybody's the same. Until you get out of that mindset, until you get to the idea that I am going to work on the most basic thing that helps me become a faster swimmer or a golfer. I'm going to do that one thing until I get it right. And then I'll go to the next thing. Nobody wants to do that. But that's what a coach should make you do.
Yeah. It's, I think becoming a good swimmer is just repeatedly doing a list of boring things. It's like, it's very simple, but it's not easy. But it's just, day in, day out, repeating these things and allowing it to become habit. And like, if I think back to all the swimmers that I've coached, and when I see them later on, the ones that have improved, they're the ones that have had the patience. They're just like, I'm not too concerned with my times today. I'm going to focus on my stroke. I'll do these sets well, but the times and so on, I'm not too concerned because I know that 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the track that this is all going to pay off. And I spoke about this concept that I heard from Simon Sinek. I spoke about this a few weeks ago on the podcast where he's got finite games and infinite games. And finite games is like, all right, you're training for a particular race because there's winners and losers and there's a certain date that it happens. But with infinite games, it's like marriage. You don't win at marriage. It's like the aim is to stay married. So if you look at swimming as an infinite game where it's like there's no end in sight, it's just something that I want to continue to do. And you've got that approach of just, I want to be the best swimmer that I can, but there's no end in sight. I think that's a really healthy way to approach it, where you're not looking to rush things. You're just happy to be there and just keep working at it. And I've found myself leaning a lot more towards that now. So, I'm in my mid-30s, but compared to when I was 18, 19, 20, I was very competitive and cared a lot about my results. These days, not so much. I just want to be able to swim until I die. And I just want to keep improving as best as I can. So I see it more as that infinite game now. Not to say you shouldn't have those finite games where you're training for a race and you want to do well. You've got to have that, obviously, especially if you're putting in all this time. But I think it's the approach that really can make the difference there.
That's a very good point. I like that. Finite and infinite. I'll keep that in mind because it kind of helps to explain this whole thing. But you're right. Patience is the key, especially in endurance sports. If you're not patient, if you're unwilling to work at it until you get it figured out and do it the right way, then you're really just wasting your time. You're just going out there and splashing a lot of water around and getting out of breath and getting out of the pool thinking you accomplished something. But tomorrow you're going to be just as slow as you were the day before. And 6 months from now, you'll be just as slow as you were before. So you've got to take this as a long range. And it's something I'm going to work on for a long time. And in order to do that, I need to know what it is I need to do right. And that's where having a coach is so important, because the coach can see you. If you can't see yourself all that well. Even with an underwater camera, you can see it. But most athletes, most swimmers, most triathletes anyway, are not sharp enough to be able to define what they're doing wrong. It's just they need to go faster is all they think. Somehow they got to go faster in the water by, just work harder is all they got to do. And that's not the way you get there.
And if they can recognize some things that they're doing wrong in the stroke, sometimes it's the things that won't make much of a difference as well. I've often seen, because when we run clinics, we've got 6 people there, and I'll sit down with each of them and I'll go through their stroke with them. And before I go through their stroke, we'll play through the video and I'll ask them, was there anything that you could notice there? Sometimes people get like all the things and they have a really good sense of it because I think they've studied it and they've watched it a lot. But then some other swimmers are looking at things that I'm not even really sort of noticing, things that they could do better, but it's something that's not going to move the needle when it comes to their speed and their time. So it does help to have someone who knows what they're doing. Speaking of coaches, what's the hardest set that you've ever prescribed? Hardest swim workout you've prescribed someone?
Oh gosh. I gotta go way back on that probably. I coached a couple of guys who were training for the Olympics in Sydney, by the way. Your
I attended those, yeah, but went as a spectator. They're amazing.
Yeah. I had a couple of athletes US team. And, uh, the other didn't make it. Good summer. He was a great cyclist, mediocre runner, and so he had a couple of strikes against him already. And I used to put him in the pool and try to work on things that would get him to the point that he could handle higher intensities. Especially, I'd try to put him in the pool with somebody faster than him, and the idea that he was just swimming in the other guys on his feet, because that's what he's going to have to do in the race. Because I was never going to get him to the point where he's going to come out of the water first. He was always going to come out of the water mid-pack. And if it wasn't for having other swimmers around him, he was going to come out of the water back of the pack. He just wasn't that good in the water. So we had to spend a lot of time just working on stamina. In this case, stamina in the slipstream of a really good swimmer. And so I would find somebody who, like the other guy I coached who were, they both lived in the same town. I put them together in the pool. And after the warm-up, we'd do these long sets, thousands, where he had to hold the guy's feet. And I had the other guy told him to go as hard as he could every time. So I knew he could do it, try to drop him. And so he would try to drop my less effective swimmer. And he had to improve his stamina. He had to improve his ability to hang on even when it doesn't feel good. You know, when you're working hard and you're taking yourself to your limit, especially swimming thousands with relatively short recoveries. I don't recall what the recoveries were now. This is back in the 1998-99 period. But that was the sort of thing that we had to work on for him, was he just had to be able to hang with the fast swimmers. And he did eventually improve. He got better, but he never got to be what I would call a good swimmer. He was a better swimmer, but he was not a good swimmer. So that was the thing we had to focus on the race also. He had to hold somebody's feet in the water to make sure he was keeping up with the race.
I love it. There's a surf Ironman swimmer or competitor that I know. He sometimes trains with our group, and he lives up in Queensland, and occasionally they've had some of the British triathlon team training with them. And he said when they were there was this one swimmer in the group who wasn't very strong in the open water and just didn't have great skills out there. And so what the coach had this surf Ironman competitor do was he said, I just want you to be on top of this guy. Like for the next 6 weeks, I want you, whenever we're in the open water, I want you to be right next to him. Make it uncomfortable for him. When you're going around the turns, when you're exiting the water, when you're starting, just be on him. And he didn't go easy on him, and he was just all over him. And then after 6 weeks, after that practice, he just got more comfortable with having other people around, and really improved his swim and his open water racing. So just practicing those things, getting comfortable doing that, makes such a big difference, especially for people who are already a bit nervous in the water and a bit uncomfortable, just training in those situations. And it's like, if you're afraid of something or you're not comfortable with it, well, just start small, work your way up. If you're scared of the open water, go at knee depth, be 2 meters off the shore. Then you can start to increase it from there. So there's a strategy to improving in everything. And often it just means start small. Like you're talking about with the technique, it's like you don't need to, just pick one thing and start at the first thing. Maybe it's posture and body position. Start there, then build your way up. It doesn't have to be, you're not jumping out of planes straight away.
I agree. That was one of the hardest things to do and bring on a camp. And I would have these triathletes for 1 week. And at the end of 1 week, one of the goals I had for them was always to be a better swimmer than when they came to the camp. And that was difficult to do because even though I was only teaching 4 things to them, the challenge was they only had actually 6 days to absorb these things before they went back home again. And so then I always gave them a pep talk at the end of the week. You've been through all these things. You now know what these 4 things are. And that's all I want you to work on. Don't work on anything else. When you get to the pool, if you have a coach on deck and the coach says, I don't want you to have your hand above the water, I want you to have your fingers in the water next to your head, like they often teach this sort of thing. If the coach says that to you and tells you to change your technique, say, yes, ma'am, I'll do that, and then go right back to doing what I told you. Do not do that. It's going to make you a worse swimmer. The idea was I want to drill into their heads that this was important, that they're going to get lots of feedback from people who they respect, probably. We're going to tell them not to do this, but I guarantee them if they did it, they would get better. So if I had them for 6 months, I could make them all really good swimmers. But if I've got them for 1 week, there's no chance. All I can do is just teach them something that they can do on their own. Then they can go back home, and for the next 6 months, they can work on that thing and become better swimmers if they're patient enough. Which is the next big issue, as we've already talked about.
Mm. If you think back to basically since triathlon began, if you could see a head-to-head race from anyone current or past, who would those two athletes be if they were to race at the Kona Ironman World Championships? Anyone from past or present?
Well, that's already taken place. Mark Allen and Dave Scott in 1989. I was there for this as I knew it was going to be in it. I can fall. And that's in the heat of it's like 90 degrees and 90% humidity, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and 90 humidity, 90%. And I recall these guys coming out of transition 2 on the run, shoulder to shoulder. And I can recall I was standing there in the heat and sweat was just pouring out of me just watching. And they were running at the time, probably at that point, running about 6 to 6:30 pace per mile. I'd translate that into kilometers, but a fast pace for an Ironman. They were pushing themselves pretty good. And they were only like in the second mile when I saw them of the run. And then I watched them throughout the race. I kept driving out to various points on the course to get down and be able to watch what they were doing. In those days, you could actually get closer to the race than you can now. And so I watched them all the way until they finally came to the last mile when finally Mark Allen dropped Dave Scott. They'd been shoulder to shoulder for 25 miles, 40 kilometers, and here they are now. They're finally getting some gap between them. And that, to me, that was the best race I'd ever been to in triathlon. It wasn't the fastest times ever, but compared with today, they're running faster times today. But the best race was those two guys. And then the book came out several years later called Iron War. And I read the book. It's an excellent book. And it really tells that story extremely well about what these guys were going through in preparation for the race and on race day and so forth. And it's just a great story. In fact, that was 1989. And the other best race that ever occurred in endurance sports also happened in 1989, although it was the Tour de France. And that was the race that came down to 8 seconds between first and second. Greg LeMond and beat Laurent Fignon. And so I got to see the two best races that I've ever seen, ever heard of. Got to see them both firsthand. It was just an amazing experience to be there for those races.
No wonder you got hooked on triathlon and endurance racing. Yeah, when you see that sort of stuff back then, that's awesome.
It is.
To wrap up, Joe. So outside of triathlon, what's something that you really enjoy doing, a hobby or something that you take a lot of time thinking about or doing outside of triathlon?
Yeah, most people don't know this, but I've been playing golf since about 1997 or 98, something like that. And I've never gotten very good at it. But there's something about golf that kind of is makes you come back to it every day. You keep wanting to get better. You think you can get better at it, and yet somehow you're just as miserable today as you were the day before. But I've used this as a learning experience for myself. So back even when I first started late 90s, I hired a teacher to work with me at my golf club to work on my technique. And over the years, I've changed teachers. I've had, 8, 9, 10 teachers over the years. And one thing I learned is two things: what not to do, and try to teach a skill like golf or like swimming. What not to do, which is overwhelm the person with just too much information, too much data, too much stuff, fill their head with too many things they got to do, and then all of a sudden they got to do it. Like in golf, your swing lasts about a second and a half, and yet the instructor's told you 5 things you got to do in a second and a half, and you're standing there trying to get all the stuff into your head, get it all right. And then you start your swing, and immediately all those 5 things are gone, and you just hit the ball again. I had one instructor like that. The other instructors have all been much more deleterious about making sure we get the right thing worked on, just as I do with swimmers. Mm-hmm. So they take one thing, which they see as the most basic thing, and they would have me work on that thing over and over and over and over until I get it right. Then we move on to the second thing. That's the good instructors. That's the good coaches also. Good coaches don't move on to the more advanced things until they get the most basic things taken care of. So the athlete really can make those moves correctly. Then we move on to more advanced things. And it's not just movement and skills. This also has to do with types of workouts you do. 5 times 3 minutes, for example, as opposed to doing 5 times 30 seconds when you first start. That sort of thing. We start with the most basic thing. We work our way up over time, and you become a better athlete. As you mentioned before, you've got to be patient to do that. And so many athletes are not patient. And unfortunately, there are coaches and golf instructors out there who are not patient either. They want the athlete to learn something immediately and know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So that's whenever I take up another activity, even ping pong, wherever it may be, somehow this always comes back to my head. How can I get better at this? And how can I take what I learned here back to my coaching with triathletes, whatever it may be? There's always this crossover going on in my head. That's always kind of like been my engineering way of seeing working with athletes. Engineers see it as fixing the problem. That's the same thing I see. I always see it as fixing the problem. What is the problem? Define the problem, fix the problem. Mm-hmm. That's what I've always seen this, and that's how I've come up with my coaching methodology over all the years is, what's the problem? How do we fix it? Okay, let's do that. But you got to think that way. If you don't think that way, you just start doing things randomly and nothing is any good at all. Like the golf instructor has you working on, 5 things on one swing.
Yeah, exactly right. I've found a very similar thing with surfing, which is probably the thing I do most outside of swimming. And all the coaches and the videos and stuff that I've seen, there's only been one coach that's really resonated with me. And I was thinking about, well, why is it? Why do I really get the concept when this guy talks about surfing? And number one, he uses really good cues and analogies. And so I've tried to integrate those more and more into my coaching, because it helps me relate some of the things. Like an example there is like when you get up on the surfboard, you want to be like a sprinter starting a race. Like you're sort of in like this position, sort of half crouch, knees slightly bent. And so I was like, that's easy to picture. So when you get up, get into that position. Then another one he uses is this coffee cup analogy. So your hand at the back is, he says, imagine you got a cup of coffee and you don't want to spill that cup of coffee. So you're sort of holding that hand up, and this is what it gives you the balance. So when you're turning, when you're sort of coming back, like don't spill that cup of coffee. So, and again, just really simple cue that within the 3 seconds or the 4 seconds you might be riding a wave, it's like, well, all right, coffee cup, done. I can do that. So I think I'm similar. I'd love to relate things back to how can I be a better coach? How can I get my swimming concepts across to the people that I'm coaching? You just can't turn off that brain. You just can't turn it off. It's going to be like that for the rest of your life. I think but that's right. It's all part of the fun, right?
You bet. I enjoy doing it. It is fun.
Joe, well, thanks so much for being on the podcast again. I've really enjoyed this, and I can't wait to share this with our listeners. So for those that are listening, you've just released the 5th edition of the Triathletes Training Bible. We'll link to that in the show notes. Anything you'd like to say to finish up here?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, just for having me on board. And I always enjoy talking with people about sport. I don't care what the sport is. If I know anything at all about it, which is I'm pretty limited, golf is not my strength when it comes to talking, but triathlon is more in that area. And I enjoy talking about that. So thanks for having me on. I had a good time.